Good evening, members. Welcome to this meeting of the Audit Committee. I'm now going to read out the emergency evacuation announcement. There are no planned fire drills, so if the fire alarm activates, please leave the building in an orderly fashion via your nearest fire exit. The two fire exits are through the partition doors and through the main doors of the hall or the storeroom adjacent to the stage. The fire assembly point is in the roundabout island in front of the main entrance to the building. Please do not delay your evacuation to collect any belongings. Please do not return to the building until given permission to do so by council staff. Please note that the meeting will be audio recorded. And could you please switch off your mobiles or turn them to silent? And toilets and hand washing facilities are available in the foyer area. All right. Yeah. Members, when I invite you to speak, please ensure you have one of the microphones in front of you before speaking, as microphones are needed for the hearing loop and for the audio recording. These are all switched on ready for you to speak, so you do not need to adjust them. Just please make sure that the microphone is directly in front of you before speaking.
Next page.
Sorry?
No, keep going.
I'll keep going, sorry. Members, voting will be done on a show of hands in line with the Constitution. I will ask for a show of hands for and then against recommendations. Those abstaining from voting will be noted by officers. What was that? No. Right, members, item 1, agenda, apologies for absence. Apologies for absence have been received from councillors Mrs Butcher, councillors Mrs Lorraine Shaw. Are there any other apologies, members?
Nobody's indicating, Chair.
Item 2, substitute members. Councillor Mrs Tony Carter is substituting for Councillor Lorraine Shaw, and Councillor Mrs Jo McPherson is substituting for Councillor Mrs Butcher. Item 3, non-members attending. Members, we have none. Item 4, minutes of the meeting held on the 29th of September 2022. Are the minutes agreed, members? Mr Mason. Councillor Mason.
28th.
No, Chairman, they're not agreed. I contacted Member Services to advise them that on page 2, paragraph 3 of the unconfirmed minutes were incorrect, in that Councillor Mrs Mason is accredited as moving a motion when in fact it was myself.
Yeah, so,
28th.
well spotted. Members, in view of the Councillor Mason's comment, will we agree the minutes subject to that being changed from Mrs to Mr Mason? Item 5, to declare declarations of interest. Members, are there any declarations of interest?
No one's indicating, Chair.
Right. The agenda item 6, the audit progress report for 22-23. Members, Mike Porter will introduce this report.
Thank you, Chair. Since the last committee meeting back in September, we have completed a further 2 audit engagements, a review of the licensing arrangements for Rochester Council, and also a review of a housing benefits subsidy claim. The licensing audit received an adequate assurance rating. In relation to this audit, there are a few minor areas for improvement. Some of the web pages on the council's site could be updated. There have also noticed some delays where an update in renewal dates, particularly for MOT and insurance certificates, and also as a requirement for a privacy notice to be published on the council's website in relation to licensing arrangements. In relation to housing benefit subsidy, across the sample tested, there were no errors identified for the rent allowances or the modified scheme. There was one error in relation to the process and the benefit for temporary accommodation, whereby the benefit was understated by an amount of £145.59p, As a result, it's an understatement, or basically there will be no amendment to the housing benefit subsidy claim itself. The claims are only amended in relation to overpayments of benefit. If I can ask members to return to 6.31, in terms of changes to the audit plan, we were looking to undertake a review of climate change. This will now be undertaken in 2023-24. Some progress has been made in relation to this area, but not sufficient work to warrant an internal audit at this time. A report is going to the Overview, Review and Scrutiny Committee in January in terms of the next steps in this area. Also included or added to the audit plan is the register of motions of notice. This has been added, and we will undertake a review of this area in due course. Coming back to the audit plan and delivery of the audit plan, we've still been unable to recruit to the vacant posts. We do actually have interviews arranged for the 28th of November, and it's a hope that we will be successful in appointing candidates at that point in time. In the meantime, we've also able to basically secure the services of a third party to undertake audits. So basically, this company will provide us with a number of audit days to help deliver the audit plan, and it is also hoped to retain the services of this party for the foreseeable future. In terms of counter-fraud arrangements, we participate in a national fraud exercise every 2 years, and we have uploaded the relevant data sets in relation to this exercise. Our Council's Peter Miles, who's the Counter-Fraud and Compliance Officer, was a finalist in the National Awards for tackling economic crime in the outstanding category, outstanding investigator category. He didn't actually win, but he was a noted finalist. In terms of recommendations, we currently have 13 live recommendations. A total of 3 new recommendations have been added in relation to the licensing audit. I'd just like to update members in relation to a number of those recommendations. Recommendation 2 in relation to the Transparency Code and Freedom of Information, that's now being implemented. Also, recommendation 1 in relation to licensing is also being implemented. Recommendation 2 in relation to risk management, the agreed implementation date for this was the 30th of November 2022. This has now been pushed back to the end of March, so we can have discussions with Brentwood Council in terms of the arrangements. Recommendation 1 in relation to emergency planning and business continuity, this has now been pushed back to the end of December 2022. I'm quite happy to take any questions in relation to my report.
Members, do you have any questions?
Nobody's indicating, Chairman.
Member, as there are no questions, there are 3 recommendations at paragraph 10.1 on page 6.2 of the report. That the update on delivering the 22-23 audit plan, together with revised audit plan at Appendix 4 be noted. That the conclusions and results from completed audit engagements in Appendix 3 and 3 be noted. And that the updated status of audit recommendations in Appendix 5 be noted. Members, are these noted?
Noted, Chairman.
Item 7. Appointment of an independent member to the Audit Committee. Members, Naomi Lewis, the Assistant Director for Resources, will introduce this report.
Thank you, Chair. So members will... Oh, it's not gone here, Ellie. Okay. It's not working.
I've done it. Just get it done, sorted.
Is that any better? I'll start, and then if it's still not working, let me know. No? Okay. No, it's fine.
Excuse me, Chairman. Would it help if we swap places? Councillor Lawman, would you like to swap places with me to listen to this report?
Okay. Okay. So, members, the purpose of this report is to recommend to full council that an independent member is appointed to the council's audit committee from the start of the next municipal year in 23-24. This is as recommended by central government following the Redmond review and is in line with SIP for best practice. Just as a short introduction, members should be aware that the government response earlier this year to the local audit framework technical consultation set out a number of plans to strengthen the local audit framework, and this was in response to the Redmond review. And it did confirm that once parliamentary time allows, audit committees, it will be made compulsory for audit committees to have at least one independent member required on each committee. As I mentioned, this is in line with SIP for guidance as well. Just to provide a small further update on this, since the report was written, there's been a further SIP for guidance that's been issued, and in that guidance, they actually recommend 2 independent members. However, I think the first step for this committee would be to recommend 1 member, and then we could obviously sort of take it from there in terms of whether we wanted to then recommend a second member at a later point in time. So I think it's kind of a timely recommendation to introduce this now ahead of it actually being enacted in legislation, so that we are prepared for that point. The proposed sort of recommendation is that the independent audit member would not have voting rights on this committee, so they would be attending sort of purely in an advisory role, so it wouldn't affect the balance of the committee in any way. And the recommendation is that they would be appointed for a 2-year term, and there is obviously further detail in the report about the sort of specification of that member and what they would be required to do. But the overall intention of having an independent member is obviously to provide that additional sort of expertise. So we'd be looking for someone that has particular kind of knowledge and expertise in accounting or audit, so they could add that extra kind of expertise to the committee's discussions. So I think the rest of the report is self-explanatory. There's obviously some more detail in there, but if anyone has any particular questions they would like to raise, then I'm happy to try and answer them.
Members, do we have any questions? Councillor Mrs Mason.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points. I'm pleased to note that the officer states that it's a non-voting situation. We've had non-voting members on standards committees for some considerable decades, dare I say, and it's worked very well. But I would like to see that included in the report, because that aspect is fundamental, and it's not actually, unless I've missed it, and apologies.
I think it is noted in the report.
Well, I can't see it on the specification.
It's to paragraph 3.8.
I haven't got 3.8. Oh, right, okay, that's fine. And the other thing that I think I'd like the committee to consider is they say that how will the candidate be appointed? And they're suggesting that this is by the Director of Resources in consultation with the Chair of the Audit Committee. I think it would be preferable to have that appointment committee widened somewhat to be a little bit more inclusive. But other than that, I certainly welcome this move. Thank you.
Councillor Mrs Wilson.
Thank you very much, Chair. Councillor Mason has covered my question in her second question, in that just basically who will do the recruiting for this, and just opening it up wider, because I think this committee needs that. That's my only comment, really. We've covered that. If I'd have known, I wouldn't have.
Okay. Well, yeah, obviously it is a matter for the committee, I suppose, to advise whether they wish to recommend or change a proposal to the recommendation in terms of the audit committee having that role in terms of appointing the member. Obviously, we have had some sort of discussions internally about the best way to sort of make sure we get the right person, and I think it was felt from the monitoring officer's perspective that having the Director of Resources in consultation with the Audit Committee chair was the kind of best way of going about that. But it's obviously a matter for the committee if they want to propose a slight amendment to that as part of this report.
Councillor Mrs Mason.
Yes, if I could come back on that. I appreciate the officer's comments, but I think it's when we're in a democratic situation and we're trying to expand democracy effectively by putting an independent person in, I think the whole process should be a little bit more open and transparent. And I do think that one officer in consultation with the chair is not a particularly open or transparent method, especially when we have two appointment committees. I'm not suggesting that we use one of those, they're probably inappropriate, but I do think it should be expanded somewhat. I'm quite happy as to how it's expanded. I haven't any particular suggestions to make, but I do think that should be considered. Thank you.
Councillor Mrs Gladstone.
Chair, it's a bit hard to make a decision unless some clarity about how it's going to be expanded. So I don't think that's something that, unless there's clarity today, that we can consider.
Councillor Mrs Mason, do you wish to make a recommendation?
Well, if we're going to have to be particular about it, I would suggest that certainly an officer, the chair of the audit committee, and two other members from other groups, or so that you've got a balance there. At the moment, there is no balance.
So is that a recommendation you're making?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to make that recommendation. I'm quite happy to amend it as well, because I didn't expect to have to be this specific. I was just concerned that the appointment system wasn't as open and transparent as I think this council would like to be. Thank you.
I think this committee could agree on an interview panel and who that would consist of. At Basildon, the interview panel was just basically the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee and the head of governance and assurance. But yeah, I don't see any reason why this committee can't agree on the numbers in terms of an interview panel, as long as the interview panel is not too large.
3 plus an officer.
Yeah, Councillor Mrs Mason, do you have a seconder?
No idea.
Yeah, I'll second.
If I can clarify that, that's 3 members of the committee, including the chair and an officer in addition, so that's 4 in total, which I think would be very adequate. Thank you.
Do any members have any questions regarding that? Councillor Mrs McPherson.
Thank you, Chairman. As the officer has mentioned that it could come back to the committee, would it be advisable that once perhaps the officer has spoken with the chair and they've come to a formula for the recruitment, that they come back to the whole committee to bring that back? Our officers can make a suggestion.
So I'm just thinking around the logistics of timing, because obviously we want to have time to recruit this ahead of the new municipal year. So I think if it was to be delayed until the next audit committee, obviously that would, I think that's not till March, isn't it? So that would shorten considerably the amount of time we've got available to sort of do the recruitment. So I think from an operational perspective, it would be preferable to agree what the makeup of that interview panel looks like now, so that we can progress that and obviously report it back into full council, because this will need full council ratification as well.
The motion, Mr. Chairman, or
Yes,
are you?
please.
Yeah, I think this seems to have a life of its own. For clarity, that this committee would appoint an appointment committee consisting of the chair of audit, and 2 other members of the Audit Committee and the Directors of Resources.
So do we just want to vote on that as an amendment to the recommendation or a new recommendation?
Sorry, members, the recommendation put forward is that it would be amended. The interview panel would consist of the chair of the audit committee plus 2 members and the director of resource. Members, do you wish to vote on that? Those 4. Against? Any abstentions? That recommendation is carried. There is 5 for, 3 against and 2 abstentions. Right. Members, there are 2 recommendations to the report. Are you willing to vote on the recommendation at the same time?
With the second one is amended.
Well, the second one, sorry. Oh.
The second recommendation is amended.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the second recommendation has been amended as per Councillor Mrs Mason's recommendation.
Agreed, Chairman.
Right, do I have to read all those?
So you need to vote for both. You need to do a vote on them.
You need to do a vote on those 2
Right.
with the additional.
Right, members. There are 2 recommendations. The first is to recommend to Council that an independent member is appointed to the Council's Audit Committee from the start of the new municipal year 23-24, as recommended by Central Government following the Redmond Review and in line with the CIPFA best practice. All those members in favour?
That's unanimous.
And the second recommendation is it delegates the recruitment of the independent member to the Chair of Audit with 2 members from the Audit Committee and the Director of Resources. All those for?
That's unanimous.
Against?
That is unanimous.
Oh, sorry, unanimous. The recommendation is carried. Thank you, members. We now move on to agenda item 8, review of the Council's risk register for 22-23. Members, Mike Porter will introduce this report.
Sorry, Chair, I think that's actually going to be me, that one.
Oh, is it? Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. So this report is the regular report that members of this committee receive. It's a 6-month review of the Council's risk register. And members will note that the last time this was presented to Audit Committee was in July of this year. So the full corporate risk register is included at Appendix A to the report, where it sets out all the key risks that the Council is facing, together with the controls in place to mitigate those risks and an assessment of whether each one is considered to be high, medium or low risk. Each of the risks is supported by a fuller risk analysis that isn't published as part of this report, but we can make that available on request. So I'll just take you through a couple of the points. So paragraph 4.3 sets out the specific risks that have been reviewed for this version of the risk register. We review half of the risks during each 6-month period. And also just to note at paragraph 4.4, that although the asset delivery programme has always had its own sort of detailed risk register, which has been reported on, as part of the local partnerships health review check, they did recommend that there was this kind of standalone risk around the asset delivery programme, which was also included on the council's corporate risk register. So that has now been added as a new risk, which is risk 17 on the corporate risk register. The three areas, sorry, just moving on to section 5, the three areas that remain assessed as having a high residual risk are as reported previously, and they are risk 3B, which is around health and safety, where further progress has been made since the last audit committee met in terms of additional training provided to officers and partners. However, there's still an element of further assurance that the risk owner feels is required around consistent application across the council, and that's why that area is still judged to be have a high residual risk rating. And then the other two risks are also as previously reported, so they're risk 9 around setting a balanced budget, and members will note that obviously the level of financial risk that the council and other local authorities are facing remains high. And then thirdly, risk 10 is the ability of the council to recruit and retain staff, and that just reflects the kind of current market conditions and sort of where the council and other local authorities are in terms of having difficulties recruiting and retaining staff. But obviously that is partly mitigated through the arrangement that we've entered into with Brentwood, where we obviously are looking to share staff across both authorities, and it's hoped that that will enable us to recruit and keep those staff. So I think probably they're the main areas I was just going to draw to your attention. But as ever, if anyone's got any particular questions they'd like to ask, then I will do my best to answer. Thank you.
Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll address this to you, but I think the Assistant Director of Resources will probably best to answer it. I have forgotten, please excuse me, I don't know who actually reviews the risk register. Is it purely the Assistant Director of Resources, or is there a panel?
I'll pass that question.
Thank you. So each corporate risk has its own assigned risk owner, and they are responsible for updating and reviewing the risk. But ultimately, I suppose it's the audits committee, part of the audit committee's function is to then review and assess all the information that's being collated by all the different risk owners, and as you have the opportunity tonight to sort of challenge or ask any questions. So it's reviewed by the risk owners, also then at corporate leadership team before it comes to audit committee.
Thank you for reminding me. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Councillor Mrs Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Mine is more of a comment than a question, if that's okay. I don't know if it would be helpful to other members on the committee, but it certainly would to myself. For future agenda items for the risk register, might it be helpful for, as part of the agenda, that the full risk analysis is given for the areas that have been looked at in the previous 6 months? I understand a risk register and I understand what goes on behind it, but with this particular risk register on this agenda, and indeed the previous one, there was no background, and I just found that a bit difficult. It would be helpful to have the background on the topics that are being looked at or reviewed, or that are considered to be of importance for whatever reason, whether it be health and safety or financial.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's obviously a reasonable request. So we can seek to provide a bit of further detail and background in terms of the risks that have been reviewed. I think the reason there isn't a lot of detail as such in the report is because those risks haven't fundamentally changed. I think in previous versions of the risk register where there has been more significant changes, we have brought those to members' attention, but because in this case the actual kind of assessment of the risk hasn't changed materially, it's only been sort of minor wording changes, there hasn't been a lot to bring to your attention, but I take your point that we could maybe just mention that a bit more in the report.
Thank you. Just people like me who are quite new to understand the background would be really helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Lorman.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. On the back of what colleague has just said there, because I've had mental questions over this, personal questions over this risk register, in that I understand where you get your information from there, but it's the input of the information on that register that I'm interested in. And I won't go into detail, but I've had concerns about the 3B with the food, etc., and some are current with enforcement. And for a year now, I'm still waiting for that result. So where would I, maybe you could just advise me, and I'd apologise for not knowing what I'm doing, but where would I go to find out what's going on and how I can argue or see? So if you say, oh, well, the rest is, reasonable, it's at high risk or whatever, you obviously get that information from somewhere. But how do I access that information to check on, which is exactly what you were saying, I think. How do I check on that that is correct? Is that register's correct? Where do I go to do that? That's my question, really.
Okay, yeah. So I think as we note in the report, each corporate risk is supported by a more detailed risk analysis, and just because of each of those is quite detailed in of itself, and obviously there's about 20 corporate risks, that would mean the report would be, extraordinarily long and probably too long for committee. But you are more than entitled to ask for that more detailed corporate risk analysis that sits behind it, and we can provide that to members or, to the whole committee on request if you'd like to see, for example, the more detailed risk register that sits behind risk 3B. So I suppose you could either individually contact the corporate risk owner, or if the committee as a whole wants to see it, then we can maybe seek on a rolling basis to bring some of the more detailed risk. I don't think we'd want to consider all of the detail of all the risks at one time, because it would be too much. But if there's particular areas that you're interested in, we can obviously seek to bring those back to committee. And also, I suppose, you are entitled to ask the relevant risk owner to actually attend the committee and sort of explain if you feel that would be beneficial, because obviously I'm not the expert in all of the areas of the risk register, but if you felt that's something you wanted, we could invite the relevant director to come and sort of talk you through that.
It's not so much I'm concerned, sorry Chairman, it's not so much that I'm concerned about bringing it to committee, but as an individual councillor, I'm not even sure that there's been a risk document raised, even though I've been in part of a question. So but my question really is how do I go and find that? Where do I wouldn't expect it from finance and so on, but where do I go to say, because I'm not even sure there's been anything raised on it. That's how I feel.
So we have discussed that risk in more detail at previous committees, but on the risk register, the lead risk owner for that risk is the Director of Assets Investment. So I suppose as an individual member or individual, you would probably want to contact them in the first instance to ask to see that more detailed, or obviously as the sort of lead for risk management as a whole, you could ask me. So either way, we can get that more detailed information to you, and then you'd have the opportunity to ask
perhaps
any further questions.
I don't want to bring it all up here, but perhaps I could talk about it later, because I don't know where to go for that information, personally. So anyway, thank you, Chairman.
Okay.
Councillor Milne.
In response, or rather listening to Councillor Lorman's points, having some sort of familiarity in a different sphere with this type of approach to risk assessment, what we get is the summary of the inputs from this format. But inside a risk assessment, which gives you the numbers, and the numbers declare whether or not it's tolerable all the way through to highly likely to impact the organisation, there should be documents for each one of these that actually list what the problems were if they come up during the year. So there's actually a record of them that relate to the findings, rather than just an anecdotal collection of thoughts, because then you've documented the whole thing. And I presume we do that, yeah? We do, right. And is that ever available to be looked at, or is that we just take it as a low, medium, high in the summary?
Yeah. So sorry, at the risk of repeating what I've said already, but there's more detail sitting behind this. So this is a summary of the corporate risk. but there is a more detailed risk assessment which sets out the individual areas that have been assessed and how they've been scored. And obviously there is a host of control kind of measures that are in place as well. So in relation to health and safety kind of risk, as you said, the health and safety officer would keep a record of all incidents or near misses or whatever. So there is supporting documentation available. It is just for the scope of this committee that we provide a summary, but you are more than entitled to ask to see that detail that sits behind it.
There is a kind of monitoring due diligence process as things continue through, which is
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just nice to know, because obviously because we wonder how it all comes together. And you would imagine perhaps you're all meeting in a room and say, hang on, we'll put this in. So there is some substance to
There's
the
quite a
chart
lot
of
of
it,
detailed
which is
work
good.
that goes on behind that, and our risk officer who coordinates this liaises with all the risk owners and makes sure that they have reviewed their risks regularly and that they're keeping them up to date and provide some challenge. So that there is quite a detailed amount of work that happens behind the scenes to bring this summary report to you.
Yeah, thanks.
Councillor Mrs Mason.
Thank you, Chair. I think we're all, sometimes we get too much information and sometimes we get too little. And obviously that's a matter of personal opinion in all the cases. But I think the officers' comments were very helpful in that where they are high, it would be helpful to have the background papers. And at any time, or very high, I hope we haven't got any very high, also, I think when a risk moves up a scale, it would be helpful to have a background paper. But I do feel that if we had the background papers to all of this, it would be unwieldy. But on the other hand, I think from the comments that Councillor Wilson, Councillor Mill and Councillor Lorman have made, that step would perhaps facilitate a greater understanding of all members, and it would mean that any questions that we have could be focused more accurately rather than general, because risk is to an extent subjective, and with the best will in the world, someone's assessment might not be the same as this committee's assessment. So it would be helpful, I think, to have that, and I think the officer's recommendation or suggestion of that was very helpful. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Members, there is one recommendation at paragraph 15.1 on page 8.4 of the report, that the content of the corporate risk register for 22-23 be noted. Members, is this noted?
Noted, Chairman.
Thank you, members. The time is now 8:05 and the meeting is closed.